Hey there, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for joining me. We are back in New York and I'm talking about one of my favorite watches from one of my favorite eras, the Zenith Rainbow Flyback from 1997. To me, this is a watch that says a lot about Zenith, about their great history, about their transition into the modern era, all of it. And it's a watch that has kind of surprisingly fallen through the cracks a little bit. I've got a retro review of this watch now live over at thedeeptrack.com. I'll leave a link to that down below. But here's a quick look at some of the features of the watch and why I find this watch just so fascinating. Now, the story of the Zenith Rainbow is an interesting one, and it starts in 1992 when they released a watch called the Rainbow to replace the popular DeLuca chronograph, another one of their great chronographs from their history, of which they have quite a few. The Rainbow was a modern sport watch that came in quite a few configurations, even different movements, different bezel configurations and designs. It was well received and it had a lot going for it, holding up well against the likes of the Omega Speedmaster and the Rolex Daytona, which was of course using a heavily modified El Primero movement at the time. Now, the Speedmaster and the Daytona, you could say, have slightly more timeless designs, whereas the Rainbow was a little bit more of its era. It looked like a watch from the 90s, and it wasn't afraid to lean into that personality at all. Now, the watch was popular enough that the French Air Force tendered a request to Zenith for a modified version of the Rainbow to fit their purposes. And the result of that is the Zenith Rainbow Flyback that you see here. Now, before we get into that, a quick note on the name. Rainbow does not refer to any particular color scheme or anything like that these watches came with. It's actually a reference to a yacht, a J-class racing yacht that won the 15th America's Cup in 1934. Now, why exactly Zenith landed on this name for the collection of this watch that came out in the 90s is not quite clear, but it's fun to speculate on. And looking back, that boat was a bit of an underdog, so it could be a bit of that spirit that they were looking to bring into this chronograph in the early 90s. And the early versions of that watch had that boat depicted on their case back. That is not the case for this Rainbow Flyback that was released in 1997, again at the behest of the French Air Force. After that request was made, France underwent some changes politically that ended up resulting in a cutback on military budgets and things of that nature. So ultimately this request was dead on arrival. However, Zenith had produced enough samples of the Rainbow Flyback that they went ahead and introduced the watch at Basel World in 1997. The result of the request from the French Air Force is quite different from the original Rainbow watches that were released earlier in the 90s. First off, in functionality, as the name suggests, there's a flyback complication that has been added to the chronograph. So once it's started, a press of the reset button here at 4 o'clock will send the timing hand back to the start and begin timing again without having to press anything else. This is using the high beat El Primero caliber 405. Additionally, they moved away from the screw down pushers, opting instead for just a straight up pump pusher here that could be pressed without having to unscrew anything or fidget with anything like that. But the real star of the show here is the dial and the bezel, in my opinion. I really love the color scheme that they came up with here, and it all has a functional purpose, which I think comes together really well. So there's a handful of colors going on here, and there's also Arabic numerals of each of the hours represented on the dial. There's that frame date window of 4:30. There's a lot going on here, and honestly, it all comes together and works better than it has any right doing, but it just captures the vibe so well that you feel like it could only have been done in 1997. The most prominent feature is the minute totalizer here, which is broken into 5-minute segments by colored sections. It starts with green and then goes to yellow and blue with white chunks in between. So it's generally what your eye will focus on right off the bat. However, there's some bright orange elements here, which are tied to the vital timing components here. So the timing seconds hand is bright orange, and the minute totalizer hand is also bright orange. There's also orange minute markers that index the first 20 minutes on the bezel. Even though the full bezel is indexed, it's those 20-minute segments that gets the orange treatment here. And all this was done in the service of making it easy to get a read on the status of anything that you were timing. There's also a telemeter scale in the Rayhot here, with which you can measure the distance between you and a sound that you hear on the horizon. Honestly, it's just a ton going on in this dial, and it's really kind of fun to dive into and explore little tiny features, like the frame around the date window at 4:30. Continues the timing scale in it. So even if you happen to stop your timing while the seconds hand is over that frame of the date window, you'll still be able to get a precise measurement here. So it's a fun detail that I think pays off really well. And aside from that, another thing that makes this watch really great is how well it wears. It's just over 12 millimeters in thickness and just under 40 millimeters in diameter. It's about 46 millimeters from lug to lug. It wears just beautifully. And a lot of that has to do with how they've shaped the wall and the case back of this watch. It nestles into the wrist really beautifully, and because of the flat sapphire crystal, it also has this really slim appearance on the wrist that I really enjoy as well. Now, I mentioned that this watch was introduced in 1997. The watch also got a more civilian version that is entirely black, and it has the Flyback label right on the dial, but only a few thousand of each of these were produced. Of course, 2001 is when Zenith welcomed Thierry Nataf to lead the brand, and he took things in a slightly different direction than the brand had been going with watches like this. for better or worse. I love this era of tool watches. 1997 is, of course, the same year that Zen introduced the EZ-M1. That collection's still going strong to this day. It's fun to think about what this collection could have become had they gone a slightly different direction in 2001 and decided to really kind of lean into watches like this. That didn't happen, and it's really taken until 20 years later for Zenith to kind of pick up the thread that had been going with watches like this. You remember the Pilot collection that was just introduced last year. There was a steel Flyback Chronograph as a part of that collection that references the exact colorways that we see here. And then that's done in a slightly more subtle manner, and that watch probably has a slightly broader appeal as a result. But this is a watch that took some chances, and I think it paid off really well. Now, I'm a big proponent of what Zenith is doing these days. I think they differentiate between their modern collections and their heritage collections really well, and I think it's only a matter of time before we start to see them recognize some watches like this from their past, and a few other hidden gems that go all the way back to the 70s that we really haven't seen resurrected yet in the heritage form. I don't think they need to bring these back one-to-one, but I think they could look at these and pick out what made these watches so special in the first place, so unique in the first place, and do that justice in its own way. And I think Zenith is perfectly positioned to do something like that. As I mentioned, I have my full thoughts, including more of the history of this watch, now live over at the Deep Track. I'll leave a link to that down below. I appreciate you tuning in. A reminder that the Deep Track is viewer supported, so I'll leave a link to their Patreon down below as well. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. And if you enjoyed this content, please be sure to leave a like and share. It helps me out a lot. Until next time, take care.